It was what she had done 14 months earlier, alone, at 11 at night, in a university lab that smelled like isopropanol and cold coffee. One quiet filing. That's the whole story. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The pen was heavier than it should have been. Or maybe that was just my hand, which had stopped feeling like mine sometime in the 40 minutes I'd been sitting in Thornfield's 22nd floor conference room, watching Isolde's attorney arrange pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The room smelled like expensive air conditioning and Isolde's perfume, something floral that had no business in a corporate building. I'd noticed it the first time I met her, the way it clung to a space long after she'd walked through it, like a territorial marker. I looked at the stack of documents. Assignment Agreement for Patent Application, number 17/842331. Effective transfer of all rights, title, and interest. Assignee, Thornfield Advanced Materials, Inc. That was mine. That was the application I had filed 8 months ago. The one that had taken me 4 years to earn the right to file. 4 years of synthesis runs and spectroscopy data, and 2 laboratory fires, and 1 methodological collapse so complete that I'd spent a weekend sitting on the floor of my apartment eating crackers directly from the box because I couldn't figure out how to want food. Vesper? Caspian's voice was careful. He had a way of using my name like a weight he was placing gently on a scale. We've been through this. I know we have. Your employment agreement is clear. Any IP developed in connection with your work at Thornfield belongs to the company. We're not taking anything. We're formalizing what was already true. Isolde said nothing. She'd stopped making arguments an hour ago. She just watched me with that particular kind of patience that isn't patience at all. It's certainty. The certainty of someone who already knows the outcome and is simply waiting for the other person to arrive at it. I picked up the pen. The nib caught on the page the way a pen sometimes does at the beginning of a signature, when your hand isn't moving smoothly. I pressed through it. Vesper Calloway. 3 signatures, 2 initials, 1 date. Isolde's attorney gathered the pages before I'd finished capping the pen. I set the pen down on the table. It rolled 2 inches toward Caspian and stopped. Thank you, he said. I didn't answer. I picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair, and I left. In the elevator going down, I thought about the night I had filed the provisional. I had been 28 years old, and it was 11:43 at night in the Materials Characterization Lab at Aldercroft University. And the only reason I remembered the exact time was that the timestamp on the submission confirmation email had arrived at 11:43:07 p.m., and I had stared at it for longer than was reasonable, because I wasn't entirely sure what I had just done. My postdoctoral supervisor, a man named Gideon who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and kept a photograph of his dog on his desk that was more prominent than any of his publications, had told me 3 weeks earlier that I needed to file. You've documented this sufficiently, he'd said, in the tone he used when he'd already decided something and was informing me of it. The synthesis pathway is novel. The efficiency data is consistent. If you don't file, you're leaving yourself exposed. To what? To someone else filing first. I'd pushed back. I wasn't sure the method was ready. I wasn't sure I wanted to deal with the administrative overhead of a patent application when I still had 2 papers to write. I was not, at that point in my life, someone who thought of herself as the kind of person who filed patents. Patents were for industry people. I was a researcher. I cared about the work being correct. Gideon had looked at me with the particular expression of a mentor who is about to tell you something you will not appreciate hearing. Vesper, you have discovered a way to produce thermoelectric films that achieve 12% efficiency at ambient temperature, using a polymer matrix that costs approximately $4 per gram to synthesize. Do you understand what that means commercially? I understood it theoretically. It means that if someone else figures out what you've done and files before you, you will spend the rest of your career citing their patent every time you want to build on your own work. That had landed. The method was called differential thermal deposition with ionic alignment, DTDIA, which I had privately started calling the Calloway method in my lab notebooks. Not out of ego, but because I needed something to call it that wasn't an acronym. The core insight was simple, in the way that most useful insights are. By controlling the temperature differential during polymer deposition at the ionic scale, you could align the molecular chains in a way that dramatically increased thermoelectric conversion efficiency. The resulting films were flexible, cheap to produce, and could be integrated into almost any surface that experienced temperature variation, which was most surfaces. Which was everything. Gideon had connected me with a patent attorney he knew, a quiet and meticulous man named Percival, who had spent 20 years prosecuting materials science patents, and who read my lab notebooks with the focused attention of someone diffusing something. "Your documentation is excellent," he told me. "I keep good notebooks." "You keep exceptional notebooks." He turned a page. "The dates are consistent with the publication record?" I had been publishing incrementally throughout the development process. Not the full method, I hadn't been ready to disclose that, but components of it, building blocks. Each paper laying out another piece in a way that established a visible developmental record any examiner could follow chronologically. "Yes." "Good." He folded his hands. "Before we file the provisional, I want to make sure you've also submitted the preprint." I had. 3 weeks earlier, I had uploaded the full technical description of the DTDIA method to ChemRxiv, the chemistry preprint server. It was timestamped. It was publicly accessible. It had already been downloaded 412 times, which had surprised me because I had assumed 412 materials scientists would have better things to do on a Tuesday. "The preprint establishes public disclosure," Percival explained. "The provisional establishes your priority date. Together, they create a documented chain of inventorship that is very difficult to challenge." He said, "very difficult," in the way that experts say things they mean to be absolute, but feel are professionally overstated to express as absolute. The provisional went in on a Tuesday in November. Application number 63/224891. Inventor, Vesper Calloway. Postdoctoral researcher, Department of Material Science and Engineering, Aldercroft University. 11:43 at night, confirmation email. Fluorescent lights, the smell of isopropanol on my hands despite the gloves. I went home and ate leftovers standing over the sink and thought, that's done. Thornfield had found me. 8 months later. The email came from a recruiter who turned out not to be a recruiter at all, but Caspian himself, using a generic subject line so that I wouldn't preemptively dismiss it. He'd told me that later, as a story, something charming and slightly confessional. He had a way of offering minor self-exposures as though they were currency, small deposits that gave you a reason to trust him. I'd met him for the first time in the lobby of a hotel in Boston, where a materials science conference was being held. He was younger than I expected for someone running a materials startup that had recently closed a $40 million Series B. He was also, I noted with the dry internal accounting I applied to most situations, significant better looking than his LinkedIn profile suggested. "I've read your preprint," he said before we'd finished introductions. "Most people read the abstract." "I read the experimental section, the ionic alignment mechanism, the temperature differential control." He had read it. "I'm building something at Thornfield that your work is foundational to," he said. "Not adjacent, foundational. I'd like to tell you about it." He told me about it over coffee, and then over dinner, and then again in a phone call 2 weeks later that lasted 3 hours, during which I walked around my apartment in circles because I couldn't think properly when I was sitting still. Thornfield was developing a line of thermoelectric building materials, wall panels, roofing systems, window films, that could passively harvest waste heat and convert it into electrical power. The commercial potential was enormous. The technical gap was precisely the gap I had spent 4 years learning to close. "Your method is the missing piece," he said. "I have a provisional patent on my method." "I know. We'll structure the IP appropriately." I should have asked more questions about what that meant. I didn't because I was 29 years old, and someone was telling me that my work was foundational, and I had not yet learned that foundational and exploitable are the same words spoken in 2 different registers. I took the job. My first day at Thornfield, I signed an employment agreement that was 47 pages long. I read it. I had always been the kind of person who read things, which people find irritating in proportion to how much there is to hide. 47 pages, and I noted 3 clauses that gave me pause. The first was a non-disclosure agreement of standard scope. The second was a non-compete clause that seemed aggressive in its duration and geographic breadth, but was industry standard enough that I filed it in the back of my mind under examine if it ever becomes relevant. The third was the IP assignment clause. Employee agrees, it read, that any and all inventions, innovations, discoveries, developments, methods, processes, techniques, or improvements, whether or not patentable, made or conceived by employee, alone or with others, during the term of employment, or that relate to the company's business, or that result from or relate to employees' work for the company, shall be the sole and exclusive property of the company. I read that clause 3 times. The key phrase was, or that relate to the company's business. That was not limited to work done at Thornfield. That was broad enough. If you read it a certain way, and a certain kind of lawyer would certainly read it that way, to potentially capture inventions made before employment, if they were related to what the company was doing. I flagged it. This clause, I said to the HR representative, a woman whose expression suggested she received this response to this clause regularly, is broad. It's standard. It's overbroad. The language relate to the company's business doesn't specify a time boundary. That could potentially be read to include work I did before joining the company. That's not the intent. I'd like that confirmed in writing. There was a pause. I'll check with legal. Legal came back 2 days later with a brief clarifying addendum, 3 sentences long, attached as an amendment. It stated that the IP assignment clause applied to work performed during the term of employment and did not supersede any prior ownership interests employee had established prior to the effective start date. I read it twice. It was better than nothing. It was worse than unambiguous. I signed the amended agreement and started work. The first year was good. I say that without nostalgia because nostalgia softens things that should stay sharp. It was good in the way that working at the intersection of what you can do and what matters is always good, which is to say, consuming in a way that felt like choice rather than erosion. The lab Caspian gave me was better than anything I'd had at Aldercroft. Larger, better equipped, with a deposition chamber I had wanted for 4 years, and a characterization suite that would have made Gideon look briefly upward at the ceiling, in the way he did when something exceeded his emotional range. I had a team. 3 graduate students on secondment, 2 engineers who understood manufacturing scale-up in ways I didn't, and a project manager named Leandro, who had the rare quality of being able to move between the technical and administrative worlds without losing credibility in either. "You're fast," Leandro told me about 4 months in. We were reviewing deposition run data at 7:30 in the evening, which was not unusual for either of us. "I know what I'm doing." "Caspian thinks so too." A pause that I catalogued but didn't pursue. "He mentions you in strategy meetings." "As in, mentions my work." "Right, your work." I had not, at that point, allowed myself to think about Caspian as anything other than my employer. He was intelligent. He was genuinely engaged with the science in a way that most executives were not. He had a habit of appearing in the lab at unexpected hours, and asking questions that were better than most of the questions I received from scientists. I had noted all of this the way I noted things I wasn't ready to evaluate yet. I had also noted that he was married. Isolde had come to the Thornfield offices exactly once in my first year, for a board meeting in which she was both a participant and the drafting counsel. She was the company's general counsel and a board member, which meant she was simultaneously the person who wrote the contracts and the person with fiduciary oversight over those contracts, an arrangement that the company's structure made technically permissible, but that I found architecturally interesting. She'd walked past my lab without stopping. She was wearing a gray dress that cost more than my car, and her perfume reached me before she did and lingered after she'd gone. Leandro appeared in my doorway 30 seconds after she passed. "That's Isolde," he said unnecessarily. "I know who she is." "Right." A pause. "She asked about the thermoelectric project last week." I looked up from my notebook. "In what context?" "She wanted to know the projected licensing revenue. Caspian told her it was premature to model." I sat with that for a moment, then went back to my notebook. In my second year, I did the work that mattered. The thermoelectric efficiency of the Aldercroft films, good as they were, had hit a ceiling. The polymer matrix degraded under repeated thermal cycling. The ionic alignment lost coherence after approximately 18 months of operational exposure. For a laboratory demonstration, these were acceptable limitations. For a commercial building material system that needed to function for 20 years, they were not. The degradation problem occupied me for 7 months. I have tried, since then, to describe what that period felt like to people who don't work in research, and the closest I've gotten is this. It felt like being in a room where you know there's a door, but the walls keep moving. Some days I thought I had it. I would run the accelerated aging tests and see a flicker of the result I needed, and then the next run would correct that back to failure mode, and I would have to begin identifying whether I had changed something, or the instrument had, or the sample preparation, or my own assumptions about what I was measuring. The solution arrived, as solutions often do, not as a revelation, but as a correction of an error I hadn't known I was making. The cross-linking modification to the polymer backbone, a structural change that preserved the ionic alignment geometry under repeated thermal cycling by creating secondary bond networks that reinforced rather than competed with the primary alignment structure, had been sitting at the edge of my methodology for months. I had been discarding it because it complicated the synthesis protocol, adding 2 steps and increasing production time by roughly 30%. I had been optimizing for efficiency of production, when I should have been optimizing for durability of performance. I ran the corrected synthesis on a Wednesday morning. I ran the accelerated aging tests Thursday and Friday. I ran them again the following week because I didn't believe the numbers. The degradation profile was effectively flat for simulated 20-year exposure. I brought the results to Caspian on a Tuesday afternoon. He read the data summary in silence for 4 minutes while I stood next to his desk, feeling the particular patience required when you're waiting for someone to understand something you've known for 3 weeks. "This works," he said. "Yes." "The degradation profile." "Effectively flat for simulated 20-year exposure." He set the pages down. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen before on his face. Not the engaged interest of a scientist CEO reviewing promising results, but something else. Something that was making a calculation I wasn't privy to. "When did you file the patent application?" he said. 2 weeks ago." He was quiet. "I filed for the cross-linking modification," I said. "Application number 17/842331. I listed myself as inventor and Thornfield as assignee on the improvements, per my employment agreement." "And the underlying method? The DTDIA process?" "The provisional I filed at Aldercroft. That's mine. That predates my employment." He nodded, slowly. "Yes," he said. "Of course." The expression cleared. He thanked me. He told me we'd move to pilot testing within the quarter. He asked if I needed anything for the lab. I said no, I had everything I needed. Walking back to my lab, I had the particular sensation that sometimes arrives before you can name what caused it. A stillness in the chest. A slight heightening of detail. I noticed the texture of the corridor wall, the hum of the ventilation system, the way the afternoon light came through the end of hallway window at a low angle that turned the dust in the air briefly visible. I went back to my desk and called Percival. "I need to review something with you," I said. We met 2 days later in a quiet conference room at Percival's office, at a table he had chosen with the deliberateness he applied to most things. He had brought his own notepad. He did not own a laptop, which I had found strange when I first met him, and now found reassuring. "Walk me through the current IP structure," he said. I walked him through it. The Aldercroft provisional, the Chem Archive preprint, the conversion of the provisional to a non-provisional application the year before I joined Thornfield. Percival's firm had handled that conversion. The pending non-provisional for the DTDIA base method, still under examination. The new application I'd filed 2 weeks ago for the cross-linking improvement, which listed Thornfield as assignee. "So Thornfield currently holds an assignment interest in the improvement application," he said. "For the improvement, not the underlying method." "Correct. The base DTDIA method patent application is yours. The cross-linking modification application is assigned to Thornfield." "Right." He wrote something on his notepad. "What happened in the meeting that made you call me?" I described the expression, the question about the underlying method, the way he'd said, "Of course," Before I'd fully finished explaining, the particular quality of a person performing a rival at a conclusion they had already reached, Percival wrote more things and did not look up. The base method application. You have documentation that development began before your employment at Thornfield? Extensive documentation. Lab notebooks from Aldercroft, all dated and countersigned by Gideon. The preprint with timestamp, the provisional filing record, the characterization data files on Aldercroft servers, with metadata timestamps that predate my hire date by 14 months. The preprint is publicly accessible? Since November of my last year at Aldercroft, it's been cited 12 times now. Percival was quiet for a moment. He turned 2 pages back in his notepad and read something he had written, in the way of someone confirming what they'd already concluded. Vesper, I want you to do something, and I want you to do it without telling anyone at Thornfield. He told me what to do. It took 4 hours. The document Percival had told me to prepare was a declaration of prior art disclosure. It was a formal submission to the USPTO. Specifically, it was entered into the prosecution history of both my pending base method application and on the record of any subsequent applications that might cite my work. It itemized, with specificity and supporting attachments, 7 independent evidentiary sources. The Chem Archive preprint, time-stamped November 14th. The provisional application record, time-stamped November 22nd of the same year. The electronic laboratory notebook files from Aldercroft, with metadata timestamps and the countersignature of my postdoc supervisor Gideon. The characterization data files on Aldercroft's institutional servers, with server-generated timestamps that existed independently of anything I could have modified. 3 peer-reviewed journal papers that had cited my preprint, each of which independently referenced and built upon the disclosed DT-DIA method. Together, these 7 sources documented public disclosure and priority dating of the DT-DIA method to a date 14 months before my employment at Thornfield, and more than 18 months before Thornfield had filed any documentation related to thermoelectric materials. The submission also included a formal statement that the disclosure predated the company's involvement in the relevant technology entirely, that no Thornfield resources had been used in any of the underlying development, and that the inventor, myself, maintained clear and unbroken chain of custody over the complete inventorship record. Percival filed this submission quietly, as a matter of record. It created no immediate dispute. It generated no public notice. It simply sat in the official USPTO record attached to my application, time-stamped, indexed, immovable. Think of it as a foundation, he'd said. Not a weapon, a foundation. Everything else gets built on top of it. I thought about that conversation during the car ride home from the signing. Isolde came to the lab for the second time 3 weeks after the meeting with Caspian. This time she stopped. She stood in the doorway in a different version of the gray dress. Or maybe the same one. I had not developed the ability to distinguish them. And she looked at the lab bench where Leandro and I were reviewing pilot test data with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this room for a while and was now confirming their expectations. Dr. Calloway. Miss Renfrew? Isolde, please. She came into the lab. She picked up one of the sample films from the display tray near the door. A flexible thermoelectric panel, roughly the size of a playing card. Matte black, unremarkable looking. She turned it over in her hands with the care of someone handling something that belonged to her. These perform at 12%? Closer to 14 with the new cross-linking modification. And the degradation profile. Effectively flat for 20-year simulated exposure. She set it down. She looked at me with the evaluating quality that she applied to most things. Caspian thinks you've solved the central problem for the entire building materials line. I think that's accurate. He also thinks that the IP ownership structure needs to be clarified before we move to commercial licensing. I had been waiting for this sentence for 3 weeks, which meant I received it with more equanimity than would have been possible if it had surprised me. The IP structure is clear, I said. The base method is mine, the improvement is assigned to Thornfield. The base method was developed in connection with thermoelectric materials research, which is core to Thornfield's business. It was developed 14 months before I joined Thornfield. Under the IP clause in your employment agreement, the amended IP clause, I said. which includes an addendum specifying that it doesn't supersede prior ownership interests. Something shifted in her expression. Minor, like a temperature change before weather. "The addendum is somewhat ambiguous," she said. "My attorney disagrees." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Isolde picked up the sample film again. She turned it over again, the same way she had the first time, as if a second inspection would yield different information. "We'll need to have a more formal conversation," she said, "with Caspian present. I'm available." She left. Her perfume stayed. The formal conversation happened the following week, in a conference room 2 floors above my lab. There were 3 Thornfield attorneys present, all of whom I recognized from various company matters. There was Caspian, who sat at the head of the table with the controlled composure of someone managing a negotiation. He had not expected to require this much management. There was Isolde, who sat to his left with a yellow legal pad and a pen she did not use. There was me. I had brought no one. The lead attorney, a man named Talbot, presented Thornfield's position in the measured tones of someone accustomed to making unreasonable things sound procedural. The IP assignment clause in my employment agreement, he argued, covered any inventions that related to Thornfield's business, regardless of when they were developed, because the amendment's language, prior ownership interests established prior to the effective start date, referred only to patents that had already been granted, not to pending applications or provisional filings. "That interpretation," I said, "is not supported by the plain reading of the amendment." "It's a supportable reading." "It's a strained reading, and it's preempted by California Labor Code Section 2870, which explicitly limits employer claims on inventions developed on the employee's own time without employer resources." Talbot looked at me in the way that litigators sometimes look at non-attorneys who cite specific statutes, a mixture of recalibration and irritation. "You're familiar with Section 2870. I read my contracts. California law may not be the applicable jurisdiction." "My employment agreement specifies California law as governing. That's on page 31. There was a pause. Caspian's hands lay flat on the table. "The modification," Isolde said, from her place with the unused yellow pad. "The cross-linking improvement. That application is assigned to Thornfield. No one is disputing that." "Correct." "The commercial product uses both the base method and the modification. You can't practice the improvement without the foundation it improves on." "That's a technical reality." "Yes. Which means the commercial value of the Thornfield-assigned patent is dependent on a foundation you're claiming belongs to you." "That's also accurate." "We're not trying to take anything from you, Vesper." Caspian's voice, careful again. "We're trying to arrive at a structure that reflects the collaborative nature of how this technology was developed. The base method was not developed collaboratively. It was developed by me alone, at Aldercroft, 14 months before I joined Thornfield. Refined collaboratively. The refinement is assigned to Thornfield. The underlying method is mine." The meeting ended inconclusively. There were 2 more over the following 3 weeks, each incrementally less collegial. By the final one, Talbot had shifted from presenting Thornfield's position as a reasonable commercial arrangement to something closer to a legal threat. He raised the possibility of filing for a declaratory judgment. He raised concerns about the validity of the employment agreement addendum. He said the phrase, "We would prefer to resolve this without litigation," in the tone that means, "We would prefer you to concede without making us litigate." He did not mention that this strategy would almost certainly fail, because I had by then assembled enough understanding of the applicable law to know that it probably would. But I also understood that probably isn't certainty, and that litigation is expensive and slow, and that I was a 30-year-old researcher on a researcher's salary who could not sustain 3 years of patent dispute against a company with Thornfield's legal budget. Which was, of course, why they had structured things this way. The pressure campaign that followed lasted 6 weeks. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. It had no dramatically identifiable moments, no single incident that I could point to as the turning point. It was incremental and deniable, the way these things always are when they're done by people who understand how to apply pressure, without leaving the kind of fingerprints that become evidence. A budget review that put my lab's equipment maintenance funding under scrutiny. A personnel matter that temporarily suspended Leandro's access to certain project files, with no explanation given that survived examination. An email from Aldercroft's Technology Transfer Office indicating that Thornfield had been in contact with them about the provenance of the DTDIA method, requesting that I refrain from making public statements about the patent application until the matter was resolved. That last one I noted carefully. Thornfield had contacted Aldercroft. They were moving to complicate the provenance narrative at the institutional level, creating enough documentary ambiguity that a clean determination of prior inventorship would require more time and more money to establish than I could practically sustain. I called Percival. They contacted Aldercroft. A pause. About what specifically? They're questioning the provenance of the base method, suggesting it may have involved Thornfield's resources or direction in some way. Did it? Absolutely not. I had the core insight 14 months before I met anyone from Thornfield. My notebooks document this in detail. The preprint documents this. The provisional filing documents this. I have never used a piece of Thornfield equipment or Thornfield funding on a single element of the base method. Then they're hoping that institutional ambiguity buys them time and increases your cost to defend. That's my read. He was quiet for a moment. Have you done the additional filing I recommended? Yes, 3 weeks ago. Good. A pause. Sit tight. I sat tight, which in practice meant continuing to come to work, running my lab, filing my notes with the consistency I had maintained for 6 years of research, and saying nothing that wasn't already part of the formal record. 2 weeks later, Caspian sent a calendar invitation to a meeting titled IP Structure Finalization. No agenda, attendees, himself, Isolde, me, and Talbot. I accepted. I told Percival the time and date. You don't want me there? He said. Not yet. There was a brief pause that communicated something Percival chose not to say. All right, he said. The IP structure finalization meeting was where I signed the assignment agreement. I don't need to describe it again in detail because I began there and the details are the same. The documents, the careful silence, Isolde's attorney with his practiced efficiency, Caspian's use of my name as a weight. What I'll add is this. Before I signed, I looked at each of the 3 people across the table in turn. Talbot was studying the document in the posture of professional detachment. Caspian was watching me with the expression of someone who has calculated a cost and accepted it. Isolde was watching me with the expression of someone who has won. That expression, more than anything else that day, was what I thought about afterward. I picked up the pen. The nib caught and then moved. 3 signatures, 2 initials, 1 date. What none of them knew, sitting across that table with Isolde's expression of certainty, was that they had just assigned themselves the right to prosecute a patent application that was going to fail. What they couldn't have known, because I had never told anyone at Thornfield, and Percival had filed the declaration quietly as a matter of administrative record, was that the prior art was already there. It had been there for 2.5 years. It was sitting in the USPTO's official record, attached to the application's prosecution history, cross-referenced to 7 independent evidentiary sources, time-stamped in a way that no subsequent document could revise. The assignment agreement transferred whatever rights Thornfield claimed to have. It could not transfer rights they didn't have. And the rights over the base DTDIA method had never been theirs to take. I set the pen down. It rolled toward Caspian and stopped. The weeks immediately after the signing were quiet. Thornfield moved quickly. They had the assignment recorded with the USPTO within 48 hours, a procedural step that required only the filing of the assignment agreement and a recordation fee. The patent application number 17/842331, previously listing me as inventor, with Thornfield as assignee on the cross-linking improvement, was now accompanied by documentation formally recording Thornfield's claim. Caspian sent me an email the day after the signing. It thanked me for my cooperation. It mentioned that the commercial licensing process would move forward, and that my role in the project would be appropriately credited. It said nothing about what that credit would look like, or whether it involved compensation beyond my salary, or what the term appropriate meant to anyone other than the person using it. Leandro found me in the lab 2 days later. He closed the door behind him. "There's a company-wide communication going out this week," he said. "About what?" "The Thornfield thermoelectric line, commercial licensing announcement. They're calling it the Thornfield process." A pause. "Not DTDIA. Not anything else. The Thornfield process." I was running a thermal cycling test on a new sample batch. The instrument produced a low, steady sound, like something thinking. "Okay," I said. "That's it? Okay?" "Yes." I checked the instrument display. "Thank you for telling me." He stood there for another moment, visibly uncertain what to do with that. Then he left. The announcement went out that Friday. It described Thornfield's proprietary thermoelectric technology as the result of years of internal research and development. It mentioned Caspian's name twice, both times in the context of visionary leadership. It mentioned mine once, in a sentence about the scientific team that had contributed to development. I read it in my office. Then I closed my email and went back to the lab. The USPTO mailed the office action on a Tuesday, 14 weeks after the signing. I did not receive it. Thornfield did, because as the recorded assignee, they were the address of record for correspondence. But Percival received a copy too. He was still counsel of record from when I'd originally filed the application in my name, and the address of record change had not yet been fully processed in the USPTO's administrative system. That happens sometimes, he'd told me. Administrative lag. Nothing to be done about it. He called me the morning it arrived. "They got an office action on 17/842-331. "What grounds?" "Prior art." A pause. "Specifically, your preprint." I sat down at the kitchen table where I'd been standing to drink my coffee. Not from shock. I had been waiting for this for 14 weeks, but because there was something about hearing it stated plainly that required stillness. "The examiner found the Chem Archive disclosure," I said. "Yes. The rejection is under AIA Section 102A1. The preprint was publicly available more than 12 months before Thornfield's effective filing date, which makes it absolute prior art. The grace period doesn't apply." I understood the legal structure, but I asked him to walk me through it anyway, because hearing the architecture of it stated precisely made it more real. Under the America Invents Act, an invention cannot be patented if it was described in a publicly available document before the patent application's effective filing date. There was a 12-month grace period, but that grace period only applied to disclosures made by the inventor or by someone who obtained the subject matter from the inventor. Thornfield was not me. The preprint bore my name as its author, describing work I had done at Aldercroft as an Aldercroft researcher, with no mention of or connection to Thornfield. My preprint was not Thornfield's disclosure. It was a public document, authored by an entity distinct from the applicant, published more than 18 months before any Thornfield documentation existed. The grace period was not available to them. "So, the base method claims they amended in—" I began. "Yes," Percival said. "Their attorneys had amended the application after the assignment to add claims directed at the base DTDIA method. They tried to capture the full scope through the back door of a broadened amendment. That's also been rejected." I hadn't known about the amendment. Hearing it, I understood immediately that it had been Isolde's strategy, seeing the assignment as an opportunity to sweep in the base method claims through an amended application, capturing the complete technology in one filing. It was efficient. It was also the move that had most thoroughly guaranteed their failure. They had overreached past the edge of what any prior art doctrine would tolerate. "The examiner's rejection cites 5 references," Percival said. "Your preprint, 2 of the 3 journal papers that cited your preprint, the provisional application record, which became public 18 months after filing, and your declaration of prior art disclosure, which is now formally indexed in the prosecution history." I thought about the declaration, the 7 evidentiary sources, the metadata timestamps, Percival with his notepad. Can they respond to the rejection? "They can file a response. Their attorneys will argue that the prior art is effectively their own, that the assignment agreement retroactively makes the preprint their disclosure. But that argument fails on inventorship. The preprint lists you as the inventor, as an Aldercroft researcher. Thornfield didn't exist in any relevant capacity at the date of disclosure. They cannot retroactively claim authorship of a document they had no part in creating. What happens if they can't overcome the rejection? The application goes abandoned. No patent on the base method, no patent on the modification. There was silence on the line. Outside my apartment window, I could hear a city morning finding its rhythm. "And then?" I said. "And then we talk about next steps." Isolde called me 4 days later. I was in the Thornfield parking structure, which was not where I would have chosen to receive this conversation, but she had called before I'd finished the commute. "You knew," she said. It was not a question, but it wasn't quite an accusation. It was the tone of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is checking it against the source. "I've known about the prior art since before you asked me to sign anything," I said. A pause. "Why did you sign?" I thought about it. Because I was interested in what would happen. The silence that followed was longer. In the concrete echoes of the parking structure, it had a slightly reverbed quality. "We can respond to the office action," she said. "There are arguments. There aren't really. Not viable ones. You could withdraw the preprint." I almost appreciated the audacity of it. That's not how academic publishing works, and it wouldn't retroactively undisclose a document that's been publicly available for 2.5 years and has been cited 12 times in the peer-reviewed literature. The citations alone constitute independent evidence of prior knowledge in the field. Percival filed a declaration. He did. That was... She stopped. That was deliberate. Yes. Another long silence. Through the phone, I heard something that might have been her exhaling, or might have been movement in a room I couldn't see. "What do you want?" she said. It was the first honest question she had asked me in the months we'd been conducting this particular negotiation. I noticed that about it. "I want what was already mine," I said. "I want my application for the base DTDIA method, in my name, unencumbered. I want the cross-linking modification to remain assigned to Thornfield, on terms, because I developed it during my employment, and that's a fair delineation. And I want a formal acknowledgement of my inventorship incorporated into any licensing documentation going forward." Another pause. "The modification is effectively worthless without the base method." "I know." The silence held before she spoke again. "I'll talk to Caspian." "Take your time," I said. "The office action response window is 90 days. They came back in 30. The meeting was different from the others. No Talbot, no secondary attorneys, just Caspian and Isolde across a conference table with a single document that was shorter than anything they'd asked me to sign before. Caspian looked tired, not from lack of sleep. He had the energy of someone who slept adequately out of discipline, but from the specific fatigue of someone who has been holding a position for a month and is now setting it down. Isolde looked like herself. That was the thing about her. She didn't perform the meeting the way Caspian did. She sat with a stillness that was not defeat. It was recalibration. "You planned this from the beginning," Caspian said. "I planned to protect myself." "That's the same thing." Maybe it was. I didn't argue the distinction. The document was a settlement agreement. It withdrew Thornfield's claim to the base DTDIA method application and acknowledged my prior inventorship on the formal record. It retained Thornfield's assignment of the cross-linking modification, subject to a licensing agreement with me, a royalty structure that Percival had provided as a starting framework, and which Thornfield's remaining attorneys had, after their own review, found reasonable enough not to fight. There was also a clause I had asked Percival to include, a formal statement to be incorporated into any Thornfield patent documentation and commercial licensing materials, acknowledging that the foundational DTDIA method was developed by Dr. Vesper Calloway, and that the commercial thermoelectric technology was built upon her prior work. "The acknowledgement clause," Isolde said. It was the only thing she said in the entire meeting. She was not looking at the document. She was looking at me. "It stays," I said. She looked down. I signed the settlement agreement. Then I sat and waited while Caspian signed it. And then Isolde signed it, her pen moving precisely. No hesitation. The notary witnessed it. The copies were separated and distributed. I put my copy in my bag. "Thank you," I said. Neither of them answered. There is a specific quality to winning something through preparation rather than confrontation. It doesn't feel like victory in the way that movies suggest victory should feel. No single cathartic moment, no surge. It feels more like a structure becoming visible. All those months ago, filing a provisional application at 11:43 at night in a laboratory that smelled like isopropanol, I hadn't known exactly what I was building toward. I had only known what Percival and Gideon had told me, which was that documentation matters, that timestamps matter, that the administrative record of science is as real as the science itself, and that the people most likely to need that record are people who've given others a reason to contest their work. I had given Thornfield a reason. Or rather, Thornfield had given themselves a reason by building a commercial line on a foundation they decided to claim rather than license. There is a difference between those two things. Claiming is faster. Licensing requires acknowledging that something belongs to someone. The Thornfield thermoelectric line launched commercially 18 months later. The licensing documentation bore my name. Not prominently. It was in the technical appendix, the section that most commercial parties never read. But it was there. Inventor of the DTDIA foundational method. Dr. Vesper Callaway, Aldercroft University. Licensed to Thornfield Advanced Materials, Inc. Royalty terms included. I had left Thornfield 6 months earlier. Not dramatically. I gave appropriate notice, completed the handover of lab documentation, attended a going-away gathering that Leandro organized and that Caspian appeared at briefly, said something about gratitude and contribution that had the quality of something pre-written, and left. The base method patent had been granted by then. Patent number US 11847-203. Inventor, Vesper Callaway. Assignee, Vesper Callaway. I had framed the grant notice. It was hanging in the office of the new materials research consultancy I'd established. A small operation, 3 people including me, and a newly barred attorney who was Percival's nephew, and had a mind for technical claims. In a building near Aldercroft that had adequate natural light and a coffee machine that worked reliably. Gideon came to see it when I opened. He stood in front of the framed grant notice for a long time, in the manner of someone reading something they'd been waiting to read. "You documented everything," he said. "You told me to." "I told everyone to." He turned around. His expression had the quality it got when something exceeded his emotional range. "You're the first one who actually did." I saw Caspian once more after leaving Thornfield. It was at an industry conference 8 months after my departure. He was presenting on the commercial launch of the thermoelectric line. I was in the audience because the conference organizer had invited me to sit on an afternoon panel about IP strategy and material science, and the morning schedule happened to include his presentation. He was good at presenting. He had always been good at presenting. He had the ability to make a room feel like it was being let in on something important, which was a genuine skill, even when what was being shared was incomplete. The presentation included a slide about the technology's foundational development. It mentioned briefly the role of prior academic research in establishing the technical basis for the Thornfield system. It included a citation. The citation was mine. During the Q&A, a young researcher in the back of the room raised her hand. She wanted to understand how the foundational patents were organized. Caspian answered smoothly. The foundational method had been developed by a previous researcher and was licensed to Thornfield. The company held the patents on its own improvements and had built the commercial system on that licensed foundation. Previous researcher. I wrote nothing down. I sat with the particular stillness I'd developed for situations that wanted to provoke movement. Then the Q&A ended and the session broke, and I went to get a coffee, and when I turned around, Caspian was standing 3 feet away. We looked at each other. He had the expression of someone who has composed themselves for a specific scenario and is executing the composition. "Vesper?" "Caspian?" A beat. "The panel this afternoon." "Yes." "That should be a good discussion." "I expect so." He nodded. He appeared to have several more things prepared and to have decided against them. He held his coffee cup with both hands for a moment. The cup was thin paper, and it looked briefly like it might be too warm to hold. And then he said, "I hope the new firm is going well." "It is," I said. "Thank you. He nodded and walked away. I watched him go. The conference room had that particular ambient noise of 100 simultaneous conversations, each complete in itself. None of them mine. I finished my coffee and went to find the registration desk to confirm my room for the afternoon panel. The afternoon panel was titled Prior Art, Documentation, and the Protection of Independent Inventors, Practical Strategies for Researchers. I had asked for that title specifically when the organizer suggested something more general. The organizer had agreed without apparent hesitation, which I had taken as evidence that precision is sometimes simply accepted when you offer it with enough confidence. I had 5 slides. The first was the title. The second was a timeline showing how documentation creates an evidentiary record that exists independently of any institutional relationship, and critically, cannot be revised by parties who did not create it. The third slide was a list of the specific documentation practices I had used: lab notebooks with supervisor countersignatures, electronic files with metadata timestamps stored on institutional servers, the preprint with its public timestamp, the provisional application, the declaration of prior art disclosure, and the incremental academic publication record that established developmental chronology in the field's own literature. The fourth slide was a summary of the relevant legal provisions: the IP ownership limitation under California Labor Code, Section 2870, the AIA, Section 102 prior art provisions, the critical distinction between an inventor's 12-month grace period for their own disclosures, and the absolute prior art bar that applies when the applicant is a different entity than the inventor, the difference between claiming prior inventorship and being able to prove it. The fifth slide was a single sentence: the documentation you create before someone else decides your work is valuable is the only documentation that cannot be contested by the people who want it. I presented for 22 minutes. The young researcher who had asked the question at Caspian's talk was in the back of the room. She raised her hand. How early is early enough? For the documentation, how far before anything goes wrong do you need to start? I thought about 11:43 at night, isopropanol on my hands despite the gloves. Fluorescent lights, confirmation email, before you need it, I said. You start before you need it. By the time you need it, it's too late to build what you needed. She wrote something down. The royalty payments from Thornfield's commercial thermoelectric line began arriving the following quarter. They were structured as a percentage of net licensing revenue for any third-party licenses of the foundational DTDIA method, plus a per-unit royalty for any Thornfield products that practiced the method directly. Percival had built the formula carefully, with an escalator clause tied to commercial scale, so that the royalties would grow in proportion to how commercially successful the technology became. The first payment was modest. It was the kind of number that, in isolation, didn't feel like the conclusion of anything in particular. It felt like the beginning of a ledger. I transferred it into the research account at Aldercroft Methods. The consultancy was called that because the name was honest. The methods we used were the ones I'd developed there. The documentation practices, the careful maintenance of an evidentiary record that couldn't be taken away, because it had been built into the public record before anyone thought to want it. Leandro had joined us in month 4. He'd sent a brief message. Thinking of making a change, interested in what you're building. Let me know if there's room. I'd called him that same day and offered the role of operations director. We didn't discuss Thornfield. There was nothing about it that needed discussing. He knew what had happened. I knew what had happened. The consultancy was what came after, and the work was the thing. 3 researchers came to us in the first year with IP disputes that rhymed with what I'd experienced. 2 had enough existing documentation to work with. 1 hadn't, and there wasn't much to be done for them, which was the hardest conversation I had that year. She sat across from me in the Aldercroft Methods office, and I watched her understand that the documentation she hadn't bothered to create 2 years ago was the document she most needed now, and there was no way to go back and create it in the past. I told her what could still be done. There were angles. There were always angles when the underlying fact of inventorship was genuinely yours. But I also told her the truth, which was that it was harder than it would have been and costlier, and the outcome was less certain. File now, I said. Whatever you have, file it today. Then we work forward from there. She did. Gideon sent me papers occasionally. They arrived by email with no context, just a link or an attached PDF, the way he communicated things he considered self-explanatory. 3 months after the settlement, he sent me a paper from the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, a quantitative analysis of patent disputes involving university-to-industry IP transfers, examining the rate at which independent inventors successfully preserved rights to foundational methods when those methods had been publicly disclosed prior to employment. The success rate across all the cases examined in the dataset was 11%. I stared at that number for a while. Then I forwarded it to Percival with a one-line message. "Good reminder." He replied within 20 minutes. "Keep the notebooks." The last time I thought about the signing room was almost 2 years after the fact. I was reviewing documentation for a pharmacology researcher at a regional university who had developed a novel synthesis pathway and had recently received a very friendly email from a contract manufacturer expressing licensing interest, followed by a very less friendly email suggesting that elements of her synthesis might fall under the manufacturer's existing IP. She had brought 4 folders of lab notebooks, dated, consistent, witnessed, a preprint in draft not yet submitted, no provisional filing. "We need to file today," I said. "The preprint isn't ready." "Submit the preprint first. We'll spend 2 hours getting it to submission ready. Then we file the provisional. Today." She looked at me. "You think they'll move fast?" "I think they've already moved fast. This is what it looks like before you've noticed they've moved." She nodded. We worked for 4 hours. The preprint went in at 2:43 in the afternoon. The provisional went in at 5:19. She drove home. I stayed and updated the documentation log. The timestamps, the evidentiary chain, the cross-references to every existing document in the record, the way I always did after a filing. When I finished, I sat in the quiet of the office for a moment. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low angle, the way it did at this time of year, turning the dust in the air briefly visible. I thought about Isolde, picking up the sample film from the display tray, turning it over, putting it back down. Matte black, flexible, unremarkable looking. She had not known what she was looking at. Not really. She'd seen commercial value, market position, licensing revenue. She had not seen the 2 years of work that predated it, the 14 months of quiet development that existed in lab notebooks and server timestamps, and a preprint that had been read by 412 material scientists before anyone at Thornfield had known what DTDIA stood for. She had reached for something that was already anchored. That is the thing about prior art. You don't file it in anticipation of a specific threat. You file it because documentation is the form that knowledge takes when it needs to defend itself. You build the record before the record is needed, and then you let the record do what records do, which is to simply exist, persistently, publicly, in a form that cannot be revised by anyone who did not create it. I closed the documentation log. I picked up my bag and walked out through the office, past Leandro's desk, where his monitor was still lit with the afternoon's case files, past the framed grant notice on the wall, U.S. $11,847,203. Inventor, Vesper Calloway. The door locked behind me with the specific sound of a mechanism engaging cleanly.